Alexandre Pantoja is the current UFC Flyweight champion. Pantoja is a Brazilian mixed martial artist who made his debut with the promotion in 2017 after appearing on the UFC's Tough tournament the year prior, where he was defeated in the semifinals. After building a record of 9-3 in the UFC, he would get his first title shot at UFC 290 against Brandon Moreno. This would be the third meeting between Pantoja and Moreno, and despite Pantoja winning both of their previous meetings, he stood as the underdog going into the fight. Pantoja would go on to prove the oddsmakers wrong as he was crowned victorious, beating Moreno again via split decision after 5 hard-fought rounds. Since becoming champion, he has defended his title 3 times. His first title defense came against Brandon Royval at UFC 296, which he won by unanimous decision. He dominated all 5 rounds of their bout, utilizing his grappling and his punching power to both take Royval down and rock him multiple times throughout their fight. Pantoja would then defend his title for the second time at UFC 301 against Steve Erceg, which he won by unanimous decision again, but in a much more competitive fight. Pantoja struggled with the punching speed and power of Erceg and was forced to focus more on his grappling to pull out the victory. Like when he won his title against Moreno, Pantoja showcased his fighting spirit, pushing through much adversity to get his hand raised, and again showed why he deserved to be champion. Pantoja's third and most recent title defense came at UFC 310 against Kai Asakura. Asakura was rewarded a title shot after having a successful MMA career outside of the UFC. Giving Asakura a title shot with no UFC experience turned out to be a mistake, as Pantoja ran through him, submitting Asakura early in the second round. This win showcased the wide gap between the skill of UFC champions and MMA champions from different promotions. Throughout Pantoja's title reign, he has showcased his grit, recoverability, grappling skill, and ability to fight at an incredible pace, which has all helped him to have a successful title run so far. Merab Dvalishvili is the current UFC Bantamweight champion. Merab is a Georgian mixed martial artist who was rewarded a contract by the UFC after Dana White noticed him during an episode of Dana White Looking for a Fight. The bout that got him noticed was one against Rufian Stouts, who was Dana White's main reason for watching the event, but Merab stole the card, knocking out Stouts with a spinning back fist only 15 seconds into their fight. It turned out that fight would be a poor representation of the fighter the UFC would be getting because he would prove to be a grappling heavy fighter rather than a striker, but nevertheless an entertaining addition to the UFC roster. Merab would earn himself a title shot after dominant wins over former bantamweight champions Peter Yan and Henry Cejudo. His title shot came at UFC 306 against Sean O'Malley in a dominant performance where he utilized his pressure and wrestling to control the pace of the fight and was ultimately awarded the victory via unanimous decision. Though he has not yet defended his title, from his dominant recent performances against 3 former champions, he has built himself a reputation for being an intense grappler and will not be an easy fighter to dethrone. Ilia Topuria is the current UFC Featherweight champion. Topuria is a Georgian and Spanish mixed martial artist who made his UFC debut in 2020 after agreeing to be a short notice replacement opponent for Youssef Zalal, who he would go on to beat via unanimous decision. Coming from Greco-Roman wrestling, Topuria was expected to be a grappling heavy fighter upon his entry into the UFC, and though he did prove to be a talented grappler very early, it was his striking that proved to be his greatest asset as he knocked down or knocked out 5 of his 6 UFC opponents en route to his first title shot. That first title shot came against Alexander Volkanovski at UFC 298 after dominating Josh Emmett throughout 5 rounds in his fight prior. Volkanovski, being the longtime champion and ranked number 2 pound for pound at the time of their fight, was looked at as the favorite by the odds makers and a large portion of the MMA community. But despite him having some success early in the fight, it was a flurry by Topuria in the second round that won him the title as he landed a clean right hook that knocked Volkanovski out. Unfortunately for Topuria, because Volkanovski was coming off of a knockout loss in a weight class above shortly before this fight, some members of the community believed that Volkanovski's chin was already weak and therefore his knockout was expected. But this narrative would change after his first title defense, which came at UFC 308 against Max Holloway. Holloway was looked at as a test of the true power of Topuria since he had never been officially knocked out or knocked down in his UFC career going into this fight. And considering Holloway was coming off of a dominant knockout win over one of the most decorated knockout artists in the lightweight division, Justin Gaethje, a lot of the community doubted that Topuria would be able to knock out or even hurt Holloway. But after 2 competitive rounds, Topuria shot a straight right early in the 3rd round that landed flush and visibly hurt Holloway. He would then follow up with a flurry of punches, which resulted in him landing a left hook, which dropped and ultimately resulted in him knocking out Holloway. By knocking out Max Holloway, Topuria has left the MMA community debating whether there's anyone currently in his division that could dethrone him, but considering he's a wrestler that has been knocking out all of his opponents, it doesn't look like he'll be giving up that belt anytime soon. Islam Makhachev is the current UFC lightweight champion. Makhachev is a Russian mixed martial artist who made his UFC debut in 2014 under the mentorship and training of UFC legend Khabib Nurmagomedov and Khabib's late father, Abdulmanap Nurmagomedov. Coming from the Nurmagomedov camp, there was no question surrounding what Makhachev's fighting style would be, and he showcased that very early in his career using a wrestling-reliant style to win the majority of his UFC fights. But what separated him from his predecessor Khabib was his striking. In many of his fights, he showcased a very developed striking game, which would go on to be a crucial part of his title run. Makhachev's first title shot came against Charles Oliveira at UFC 280. Despite Oliveira being the most decorated submission artist in UFC history, majority of the community had a feeling that Makhachev would be able to neutralize the submission offense of Oliveira with his wrestling. But doubt began to creep in when it came to striking because Oliveira had proven to be a dangerous striker throughout his UFC career and especially throughout his title run. But in the second round of their fight, it was Makhachev that landed a right hook that dropped Oliveira. He would follow him down and sink in an arm triangle to submit Oliveira and become champion. Oliveira was regarded as one of the best champions in the UFC, so Makhachev defeating him so dominantly was a huge statement. Since winning the belt, Makhachev has defended it 3 times. His first title defense came at UFC 284 against Alexander Volkanovski, who was the featherweight champion at the time and was moving up in weight in an attempt at champ status. Makhachev was able to pull out a win over Volkanovski via unanimous decision, but in a very competitive fight, which many people believe Volkanovski should have won. Him struggling against a fighter from a lower weight class brought him a lot of criticism as the community began to question how good he really was. Makhachev would again face Volkanovski at 294 for his second title defense, but this time it was on short notice after Volkanovski agreed to take the fight as a replacement for Oliveira, who was originally supposed to fight Makhachev for the belt but got injured. Makhachev would knock out Volkanovski with a beautifully set up head kick in the first round of their rematch. Despite the win being impressive, a lot of the community chalked the win up to Volkanovski making a poor decision taking the fight on short notice instead of having a full camp to prepare himself. So Makhachev again faced criticism. Makhachev's third and most recent title defense came against Dustin Poirier at UFC 302 in a competitive bout. Poirier had moments of success, but Makhachev utilized his wrestling and improved striking to control the fight. He would go on to submit Poirier in the 5th round to retain his belt. Unfortunately for Makhachev, he would again face criticism as people began pointing out that champions that have faced Poirier in the past, which included his mentor Khabib, finished him quicker and had much less trouble fighting him. Despite the controversy over some of his title wins, there's no denying that Makhachev is one of the most well-rounded fighters in UFC history and is well deserving of being ranked #1 pound for pound at the time of this video. Belal Muhammad is the current UFC welterweight champion. Belal is an American mixed martial artist who made his UFC debut on July 7, 2016 after agreeing to be a short notice replacement opponent for Alan Jouban, who he would go on to lose to via unanimous decision in a competitive fight. That debut fight showed you everything you need to know about Belal. Despite him getting knocked down 3 times throughout the course of that fight, he was able to use his wrestling and recover ability to survive and make it to a decision. Despite him losing, you could see the seeds of the champion he would later become already being planted. Belal's first title shot came 8 years later against Leon Edwards at UFC 304. Throughout those 8 years, Belal gradually improved his skills, going from primarily a grappler to a heavy pressure grappler who could also outstrike you, and that was very apparent in his fight with Edwards. Edwards, coming from a striking background, was thought to be clearly the better striker between the two, but Belal's pace, pressure, and takedown threat resulted in him outstriking Edwards. But Belal not only dominated when it came to striking, but he also got Edwards down 9 times throughout the fight, which helped him secure the unanimous decision victory. He has not defended his title as of yet, but his development as a dual striking and grappling threat, mixed with the pressure he fights with, is making him look like a tall task for anyone that has to fight him. Dricus du Plessis is the current UFC middleweight champion. Dricus is a South African mixed martial artist who made his debut with the promotion in 2020. Despite him having some competitive fights and some close calls, Dricus held an impressive 6-0 record in the UFC before his first title shot. He was given that first title shot at UFC 297 against Sean Strickland. Throughout his fights leading up to his title opportunity, there were a lot of questions surrounding his cardio because there were several fights where, in the later rounds, Dricus seemed visibly tired, he was breathing heavily out of his mouth, and because Strickland was known as such a workhorse, there were some doubts whether Dricus could go all 5 rounds. But he proved anyone that doubted him wrong, going all 5 rounds and winning a split decision. There was some controversy after the fight. Some people felt as though Strickland should have won, but regardless, Dricus fought a very competitive fight and showed that he can go 5 rounds. Dricus' first title defense came against former long-reigning champion Israel Adesanya at UFC 305. Despite losing the belt to Strickland in convincing fashion, Adesanya entered the fight as the favorite. Many believed that his sharp kickboxing and footwork would be too much for Dricus to handle, and while at moments that looked to be the case, the fight seemed to be slowly building in the corner of Adesanya. In the 4th round, Dricus was able to land a variety of punches, which seemed to hurt Adesanya. He secured a takedown and sunk in a rear naked choke to finish the former champion and retain his belt. While there was some controversy around his fight with Strickland, his win over Adesanya was definitive and highly impressive. Of all the current champions, Dricus seems to be doubted the most due to his unorthodox style, which seems almost sloppy, but by taking out Robert Whittaker, Sean Strickland, and Israel Adesanya in his last 3 fights, he's putting to bed any doubt regarding his worthiness of being champion. Alex Pereira is the current UFC light heavyweight champion. Pereira is a Brazilian mixed martial artist who moved up to the UFC's light heavyweight division in 2023 after being knocked out by Israel Adesanya in his fight prior. The reason he changed weight was due to him claiming that the weight cut to make 185 was too draining on his body, which would make his chin weaker. And from his run at light heavyweight, which is 205 pounds, that looked to be a good decision by Pereira. He was given the opportunity to fight for the vacant light heavyweight championship at UFC 295 against Yuri Prochaska after Jamal Hill, the previous champion, vacated the belt after rupturing his Achilles. He was selected to fight for the vacant title due to him holding a win over former light heavyweight champion Jan Blachowicz, and because he was a former champion himself in the UFC's middleweight division. Despite his opponent also being a former light heavyweight champion, Pereira entered the bout as the favorite. After a competitive first round, Pereira would knock out Prochaska in the 2nd round. After the fight, there was some criticism surrounding the stoppage, as people didn't believe that Prochaska was knocked out when the fight was stopped. Since winning the title, Pereira has defended it 3 times. His first title defense came against Jamal Hill at UFC 300, who, if you remember, was the champion who vacated his belt after suffering an Achilles injury. Pereira was able to easily get past Hill, knocking him out in the 1st round. Pereira's second title defense came against Yuri Prochaska at UFC 303. Prochaska was given a second chance at fighting Pereira for the belt due to the controversy over their first fight, and Prochaska managed to get a big win over fellow contender Alexander Rakic. Unfortunately for Prochaska, he would face the same fate, but this time in more convincing fashion, as Pereira again knocked him out in the 2nd round. Pereira's 3rd title defense came against Khalil Rountree at UFC 307, and despite Rountree being the least credentialed opponent of his run at light heavyweight, Rountree managed to give Pereira the most issues of all. Rountree utilized his explosiveness and power to cause Pereira issues on the feet and visibly hurt him at one point in the fight. But Pereira utilized his stamina, defensive awareness, and striking IQ to outlast Rountree and managed to slowly break him down, resulting in a climactic finish in the 4th round. With his 3 title defenses, Pereira set the record for the shortest time between 3 title defenses, as all 3 of those fights occurred within only 175 days. While Pereira still has yet to face an elite grappler during his title run, which should test him in a new way, the dominance of his early title run will make it difficult to bet against him going forward. Jon Jones is the current UFC heavyweight champion. Jones is an American mixed martial artist who moved up to the UFC's heavyweight division in 2023 after having an extremely successful career at light heavyweight from 2008 to 2020, where he won and defended the light heavyweight championship multiple times. Jones was awarded an opportunity to fight for the vacant heavyweight title against Ciryl Gane at UFC 285 after the former champion, Francis Ngannou, vacated the belt over disputes regarding his contract. Jones was given a chance to fight for the heavyweight title in his first bout at this weight due to the success and legacy he built while at light heavyweight. Despite never fighting at heavyweight and being inactive for the past 3 years, Jones was the favorite going into the fight. He managed to live up to the odds as he easily got past Gane, submitting him in the first round of their bout. With the win, Jones became both heavyweight champion and the first person to ever finish Gane in his MMA career. Jones defended his belt once so far, which came against former heavyweight champion Stipe Miocic rematch at UFC 309. There were large amounts of criticism given to both the UFC and Jones for scheduling this fight due to Stipe being out of his prime and him not being active since 2021. Regardless, the fight continued to take place and Jones proved the critics right, knocking out Stipe in the third round of their bout. Despite the criticism surrounding his run at heavyweight, the success he's had at this weight has only added to what he's done at light heavyweight and is solidifying his case for being one of the greatest mixed martial artists of all time.